And what I was saying is what we're going to do today is look at this essay from the back of Turn of the Screw. But first I'm going to talk a little bit more about psychoanalysis. I'm going to talk about your quiz just for a minute or two, and then talk about Jacques Lacan. And then we'll take some time doing some in-class reading. I'll have you read through this essay, kind of skim it, and then get together with your group towards the end of class. And you can kind of work things out for your reading this week on psychoanalytic criticism. Again, will not be an interpretation of a primary text. What will be an analysis of a secondary text. So you'll be saying, we think that Zacharias is really smart here. We like this. We like that. We had some questions about this. Our reading of this scene looks more like this. How does he square that with our reading of the scene? Or this seems wrong. This seems completely a wrong reading of the governess, from our perspective. And this is why. Okay? All right. So to your quizzes really quickly. I asked you the three questions about, almost everybody got that hypnosis is the foundation for psychoanalysis, right? That when Freud studied with Charcot, he came back learning hypnosis, and that became, that idea of the mind being in a relaxed state became the goal of psychoanalytic criticism, to get below that kind of anxious top layer of the ego where it lets down a little bit. That became the main thing. The second question I asked you is that Freud's earliest writing with Brouwer focused on, and I kind of tricked you, I wrote a few things that seemed plausible, but what I was really looking for was hysteria, because that was their first two papers were actually, hysteria was in the title, that's what they were interested in. And the book, his essay makes that clear. And then finally, Freud's more mature method between psychoanalysis and patient was focused primarily on free association. What I want to sort of stress here is, I gave you, I kind of felt like the one thing psychoanalysis is not is an open discussion between two people. And the reason it isn't just an open discussion between two people is that when we have an open discussion between two people, we're usually very defensive. There's a defense up. This is the psychoanalytic perspective. You might not agree with it, but all those things that you bring to your everyday actions, even with a loved one, maybe even especially with a loved one, when you have a conversation, you're heavily defended, right? And when you and just compare it to what happens if the two of you were, let's say I was going to have a discussion with Hayden. He was supposed to come meet me in my office, and I fell asleep. And he knocks on the door, and he's like, "What the hell?" And he kind of tests it, and it's open. And he's like, "Oh shoot!" And he kind of leaves the door open, and he just sits down and he falls asleep. And then we both start talking in our sleep, right? That would be a less defended, more honest conversation than if he walked in and he said, "I'm having trouble with my paper, Dr. Ruderman, what can you help me?" Because our defenses would be down, we'd be at this place, right? Now, of course, that's not going to happen and whatever, but psychoanalysis tries to create the conditions for that kind of sideways conversation out of the periphery, where you're not paying too much attention, you're not too focused, you're not too heavily defended. That's why that question, an open dialogue between two people, wasn't what I was looking for. And then about transference. This is very important that you get this. So transference, most people got something kind of right, but I was really specifically interested in two things about transference that you get. One is that in the psychoanalytic context, it is the repetition of a situation that had happened usually with parents, let's say, but it could be with other people, could be others, right? This is especially true if you had other people in your early childhood you were close to, or if you had suffered a trauma. Let's say you had been abused in a way by another family member, something like that. The repetition with the parents through the patient to the analyst. So what you get is a situation where the patient is experiencing the analyst as this earlier figure. And it's really important that this happens, and it's useful when it happens. Most of us know what this is like in our like I talked about before, the kind of compulsion to repeat, the way in which we repeat the same things over and over again, and go through and experience a certain amount of discomfort because of it. But the important thing that comes out of psychoanalytic thinking is that transference is both a repetition and a new event. So it's not that if you hate your analyst because you're experiencing a repetition, the hate is real. It's real. It doesn't begin there, but it's real, and it has the same consequences in your body, to your nervous system, to the interpersonal relationship you have with that person. It's just as real. So it's real, but it doesn't begin there. So it's important to recognize that it is. If you ask the question, is transference a repetition or a new event? The answer is yes. It's both, right? So that's what's important about this theory of transference, is it gives us an understanding that if the governess is reliving a relationship that had happened back in her little town, maybe with her father or whatever, with Quint, who's this dead person, it is both real. She's really experiencing it, and it has real consequences in whatever happens to Miles at the end. Whether he has a heart attack or what, we don't quite know. It's unclear. But whatever happens, it has real consequences in the world. It's real. So it's both a real event and a repetition. And it's important to work through the repetition so that you cause less harm to yourself and to other people. That's the goal. Is that clear about how transference works? So the analyst, again, like I said before, uses him or herself or themselves like, as Jacques Lacan says, like trash. You can use me like trash, because that's my job, is to be that empty thing that you can project on. Now, why won't transference work sometimes? Sometimes the person is too heavily defended. Sometimes the therapist or analyst doesn't open up enough, or doesn't provide it, or puts too much of themselves in. That's one reason. If you go to an analyst and you go, well, do you have kids? What do you expect the answer will be?
To me, yes or
no. No, it's neither yes or no. I swear to God, it's never yes or no, because they're trying to respect what they call the frame or the chair. So the chair that the analyst sits in represents a kind of open space. So they'll often say things like, oh, that's interesting. Why do you want to know that? I'm interested in why you're so interested in that. Is that because you have kids? Is your thinking that I wouldn't understand your situation with your kids unless I had kids? You know what I mean? And then they throw it back, right? And I think it's the right thing to do in a way, because that if you had too much specifics and you're always trying to get specifics on that person, then they wouldn't necessarily be as easy an object, right? But you'll focus on something. Like I said, but well, you have a mustache just like my brother, and that just, maybe that was the connection. You'll find something, but it can't be too concrete, so it shuts out that possibility. Okay, is that clear? All right. So, because this is a really important theoretical point and you all got the last one about how literary criticism, of course, is connected. All right, let me hand out this essay by Jacques Lacan. It's very short. We're not going to read it right now. But I think what I'll do is I'll read a little bit of it so that we get a clear understanding of the mirror stage. I thought it's important for you to have it because it's not in your book. Instead, you have a good essay, an essay that I know my colleague Rob Hughes has thought a lot about. And I think a lot of literary critics have thought a lot about this one. The one I'm talking about, called The Purloined Letter. which is about a story by Poe. Uh, okay, so do you remember what I said before about the mirror stage?
It's like the ed, no, the ego, right? Or is it ed? The I word.
The mirror stage is the that's interesting to think about it in terms of the I don't know if I mentioned the third or the second topology in relationship to Lacan, but anybody else on the mirror stage remember?
Isn't it like when you finally start to realize that you're
Yes.
I?
Yes. So it's sort of that, in a certain sense, it's the birth of the ego or something like that. We might consider it the birth of the ego, the birth of the subject. Let's use that word in here from now on because it's an important word in theory, subject, right? So it's the birth of the subject. You might have an individual before, or actually not. You kind of have an undivided, not individual, a non-dividual person before that, right? A person who's not divided from the mother, or not divided from whatever. But then the child sees itself in the mirror, it recognizes itself, but that recognition is always a misrecognition. That's the important part. You're not really seeing who you are, you're seeing what your reflection looks like. Right? And then from the rest of your life, the way you see yourself it's very difficult to see yourself from yourself. You see yourself as others see you. And you see yourself in language, right? As an I. Right? That's one of the reasons why when somebody says, I don't know if you've ever been asked to introduce yourself and you're like, what's your name or something. I never say I'm David because I'm not. So I say, my name is David. I'm not David. I'm not, that's ridiculous. I'm this experience, this walking experience of the world, neurotic and messed up as I am, and it is, I am not David. I mean, that's just what my parents named me. So that's why I'm really, I just, it's like by now, I've been doing it like 30 years, yes.
I read a paper last semester on how language changes how people see their perspective on the world.
Yes.
So in German you say ich heiße, which is I'm called.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes sense to me now, because when you don't say ich bin, we do. We say I am, but
yes,
that's
excellent.
Interesting.
Excellent. And it would be, if I was really good at this, I would probably, if you said what do you do for a living, I wouldn't say I'm a professor. I would say I teach English. I teach literary theory, or I teach poetry, or I teach whatever, right? Because I am not a professor, right? And then it gets worse. It's like gender. Okay, I have this kind of genital. You know what I mean? Like I have that chromosome, rather than I am that thing. That's the idea. Is like you're not, because you get reduced to that thing, and it becomes a misrecognition of who you are. And you come to psychoanalysis all confused because you feel this way, and your label is this way. That way that you're labeled, this is important for Lacanian theory, that's called the symbolic. It's important to be in the symbolic because if you're not, you can be a psychotic, right? It's important that it's important to have those boundaries, those limitations, those names. They're important, but it's important to know that they're not you. Does that make any sense? Because so that's why it's important to be able to live in the symbolic. That's why when a child learns language, if a child is having problems learning language, a child is having problems with specifically the symbolic register. Okay, so let me read a little bit of this essay by Lacan, and then I'll talk about it, and then I'll move through this, and then we'll get to the writing section where you guys get to do some writing. One of these is stapled. Here we go. All right. So as I said before, Lacan was a talker, and he didn't really write a super lot. He wrote a few essays, but most of what we have from him are these seminars that he gave, and they were very popular in France. By the 1960s, this is an early one, as you see, 1949. By the time the later ones, he had been kicked out of this International Congress of Psychoanalysis. He was just because of his ideas, they were too radical, and he was holding forth at the École in Paris. He was like a big teacher there, and was also practicing psychoanalysis in a very weird way in Paris. And people and that became who he became. All right. The mirror stage is formative of the function of the I as revealed in psychoanalytic experience. The conception of the mirror stage that I introduced at our last Congress 13 years ago has since become more or less established in the practice of the French group. However, I think it will be worthwhile to bring again to your attention, especially today, for the light it sheds on the function of the I as we experience it in psychoanalysis. It is an experience that leads us to oppose any philosophy directly issuing from the cogito. You guys know what the cogito is? Okay, Rene Descartes. You want to say what?
It's like the logical, like function, like side of your brain, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Like not the artistic or like creative or like duplicitous one, but instead of like the logical, rational. This causes this, one X to Y relationship.
But he actually means a specific quote from Rene Descartes. Does anybody know what it is? Yes.
I think Victoria.
Yes, exactly.
Cogito.
So this idea, the cogito ergo sum, translates into I think, and therefore I am. I know that I am, right? And Lacan rejects this absolutely, right? That our thinking. It's not that he's saying that you aren't something, but whatever he would say. I can't remember how he rephrased it. Something like I am other than the place that I think, or something like that. I am other than the place that I think. Whatever I am is other than this place that I think. So that's what he refuses it because of this mirror stage of understanding. Okay. Some of you may recall that this conception originated in a feature of human behavior eliminated by the fact of a comparative psychology. The child at an age when he is for a time, however short, outdone by the chimpanzee in instrumental intelligence, can nevertheless already recognize as such his own image in the mirror. This recognition is indicated in the illuminative mimicry of the aha, or Leibniz, which means experience, I think, aha experience, like aha, there I am, which Kohler sees as the expression of situational apperception, the essential stage of the act of intelligence. This act, far from exhausting itself, as in the case of the monkey, like the monkey sees itself and it's like thinks it's another monkey, is interested in it, and then just leaves. We never leave the mirror. Do you know what I mean? We're always checking to see how we appear to other people and to see if we're still there. Now, some of you may be better off than me. I can't help it. I'm like, do I have a booger? Do I look okay? You know, usually it's how tired do my eyes look today? You know, like that's the thing. Like, does the sweater look okay? You know, whatever it is. You know, we're checking ourselves. The monkey just leaves it. We're fascinated. Literally, that means to be fastened, right? To be not able to move. We're like fascinated by the mirror. I was once in Central America in a small village, and there was actually no mirror. And there was no electricity either, but like I spent time in just being with these people. It was so freeing. I forgot that I was somebody who looked the way that I looked or felt the way, you know what I mean? Well, I never forgot that I was a white Americano, because they don't let you forget that. The children follow you around like your TV and they watch it all the time. But like, except for that fact, I forgot the fact that I was this other thing. Okay. The image has been mastered and found empty, immediately rebounds in the case of the child in a series of gestures in which he experiences in play the relation between movements assumed in the image and the reflected environment, and between this virtual complex and the reality it reduplicates, the child's whole body and the persons and things around him. This event can take place, as we have known since Baldwin, from the age of 6 months, and its repetition has often made me reflect upon the startling spectacle of an infant in front of the mirror. Unable to as yet walk or even stand up, and held tightly as he is by some support, human or artificial, he nevertheless overcomes in a flutter of jubilant activity the obstructions of his support, and fixing his attitude in a slightly leaning forward position in order to hold it in his gauge brings back an instantaneous aspect of the image. For me, this activity retains the meaning I have given it up to the age of 18 months. This meaning discloses a libidinal dynamism in which has hitherto remained problematic, as well as an ontological structure of the human word, blah, 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 blah. And then he goes, we have come to understand this mirror stage as an identification in the full sense that analysis gives the term. Namely, the transformation that takes place in the subject when he assumes an image whose predestination to this phase effect is sufficiently indicated by the use in analytic theory of the ancient term imago. This jubilant assumption of his specular image by the child as the enfance stage. Enfance, do you know what that word means? Like infant? What does it mean? No, do you know what it literally translates into?
Mm-hmm.
Without language. Without language.
Is that Latin?
Enfance? I don't know. Maybe probably it's a Romance language. It must be Latin and derived. But it means without language. Still sunk in his motor incapacity and nursling dependence, would seem to exhibit in an exemplary situation the symbolic matrix in which the I is precipitated in a primordial form before it is objectified into the dialectic of identification with the other, and before language restores it in the universal its function as a subject. Okay, I'm going to leave it right there. You've got this essay in case you want to refer to it in the future. It's a very famous essay. A lot of his later work is based on this understanding that there's a misrecognition, that there's a problem with our subjectivity as never being fully formed. Do you see, can anybody talk about how we're seeing a connection between structuralism, deconstruction, and psychoanalysis? Yeah, Cameron?
So, mostly just between deconstruction and psychoanalysis,
yes.
Because I feel like structuralism kind of lacks this because it doesn't talk about the aporia at all.
Okay.
But both this and talking about the I and deconstruction talking about the aporia talks about like how subjectively like two words can never have the same meaning
yes.
to two individuals.
Yes.
And so like individual interpretation is the only thing that like you can be truly sure about is how you relate to it or how someone else says they relate to it. But there is no objectivity in the language as it represents what it's attempting to represent.
Okay, great. So the only thing I would put a pressure on is I think in structuralism there is that question because he says, Saussure is very clear that there's an arbitrary nature to the signifier. So, and it needs to be understood in context. So anytime you don't have enough context or you don't understand the arbitrary nature fails, you actually misunderstand. So you slightly misunderstand everything. And Saussure is aware of this, that we never completely understand another. But I think that what we're seeing is like what ties this theory together, what ties all the theories together so far, I think, is this kind of instability in what we had considered so stable, i.e. language, writing, discourse, speech. There's an instability, subjectivity. There's a kind of a glitch in the system, and this glitch in the system is not to be necessarily. This glitch in the system is not to be necessarily something that we worry about or moan about. We simply, I think, in the best case scenario, we accept as almost beautiful the fact that I can never know another person completely, right? It's really hard, but I mean, I think that's the challenge that we have. That language always produces multiple plural meanings, and that subjectivities are always, in Freud's words, overdetermined. Right? Anybody else on these connections? Other connections? So I think this idea that language is a blessing and a curse is part of what's being given to us here. Is this idea that it's both an absolute necessity and a curse, and it's also always changing, right? Always sort of developing. All right. So we talked about the mirror stage. We talked about that misrepresentation. Last time I was ending when I short of being able to tell you this sort of important idea from Lacan, where he says language is structured like the unconscious, and there's a couple different things that I think he means here. I think he means that the very thing that Cameron was just telling us, which is that language does not equal itself, right? And that's true about the unconscious. What's in the unconscious does not equal what we think about it. It's always sort of different. The other thing has to do with time. Language always has this problem of temporality, and Freud said there is no time in the unconscious. What do you think he means by there is no time in the unconscious? Go ahead, Miranda.
Well, I was thinking that a lot of times people say time is like a construct.
Yes.
And that you're always like, at least I always have a constant monologue going on.
Yes.
And you're always, maybe you're thinking about the past, you're thinking about the future, or you're thinking about the present, but it's never. We think, especially in English, we think in terms of
linear time,
not
yeah.
circular.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some languages that do think linear. They don't have they don't have a past tense, present tense, or a future tense. So I think it depends on what language you think in, what's your
yes,
language.
it may very well be that many of the sort of truths of psychoanalysis are more true in the Western world, given our own understanding of temporality. I would say that with the spread of globalism and capitalism and all these things, that linguistic determination is its importance is lessened. I think there's a kind of I would say that there's a kind of global unconscious, which is maybe named Nike or whatever. I mean, it's just like, it just is, and it kind of permeates this and kind of undoes those specifications, which is probably why people are so interested in going back to language, going back and trying to capture something lost, but I think it's lost cause. Yeah, that's great. So you can think about the present at the same time as though we're what Freud also says, and this is important about temporality, is that if you have a certain event happen here in your life, let's say at 33 years old, you have an event happen here at 33 years old, like let's say you get mugged, right? And it's really scary. Somebody pulls a gun on you and you're held up at gunpoint. It can trigger an event back here that was in your unconscious that actually this whole time was not traumatic, but this event will make this event traumatic. Does that make any sense? Like the time that your brother hit you with a baseball bat. Just say it sort of sits in the back of your head and you don't think about it, right? And then suddenly you have this event and that event becomes traumatic, right? So what happens is that the present actually changes the past. And Freud calls this Nachtragliche, I think, the kite. I'm not sure of the spelling, something like that. I think that there's only an E there. Hold on. Nachtragliche. I think it's like that. Which means kind of like knock. Wait, I didn't. Yeah, that's a CH if you can see that. Nachtrgle. Keit, I think that's right, troglodyte, which means to kind of drag from the past into the present. And there's a fluidity of time. Sometimes this is referred to as deferred action. Sometimes it's referred to as other things. So in the unconscious, you can have, sitting right next to each other, you can have something that happened 30 years ago and something that happened yesterday. And there's no differentiation. They feel exactly the same. That's why when you caught up in a repetition, and it's like, boom, suddenly you don't understand why you should feel this so intensely. You know, it's only one incident of whatever, but you feel it so amazingly intense. It's because this thing in your unconscious doesn't have the perspective of time. It feels like it's happening right now. So people with PTSD, when they are triggered, they feel like the thing that happened in a war zone or that happened in an abusive relationship is happening right at this moment. All the feelings are just as real in the body. The unconscious has no time. There's no time in the unconscious. So language is structured like the unconscious insofar as language also plays with temporality, plays with subjectivity. It has multiple possibilities.
I think like in one way that it's similar to like what you were just talking about, the unconscious. Like things that are like temporally like close to would be like considered metonymic, but the fact that this 33-year-old event would have like some relationship with the previous trauma of the past would be metaphor.
Oh, that's excellent. Yes, yes. That's great. You can even think about you can even think about the subjective experience. I think what you're suggesting is that language is structured like the unconscious, partly because we have to think about the language think about the unconscious through language. It's the only way we can think about it is through thought and language and semiotic systems of symbols and other things. So therefore, all of the tropes that we use in language can also be related to all of the, by tropes I mean metaphor, metonymy, repetition, chiasmus, all these kinds of things can also be applied to subjectivity, right? That's beautiful. So like you can almost say that like if you fall in love with someone who has the same kind of eyes as a girl who you knew in high school, but never had the courage to talk to, you fall in love with another person that has the same colored eyes, you could say there's something either metaphoric or metonymic, depending on the way you think about it, about that pair. So the unconscious then gets treated in those terms. Okay. I'm going to say really quickly the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. This might come up in your essay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of my understanding of it, because almost Lacan is a very tricky writer. It's very unclear exactly what he means by it all the time, but and it kind of changes over time, and this is a later idea for him. The way I understand it is that the imaginary is the way is the sort of stories we tell ourselves about our experience in the world. And we do it defensively almost in order to make sense of things in the world, right? So here's a psychoanalytic story. When the child experiences something confusing in the parent, Freud's initial idea about this had to do with what he called the primal scene, which is, of course, intercourse. By the way, isn't it interesting that the word intercourse, which of course means copulation or sexuality or something like that, not something like that, exactly that, also means speaking. Yeah, it's interesting to me that they mean the same. It's the exact same word. It means exactly the same thing. Which is not to say that they're the same thing, but that they are related in this way that I think that when we think about language and psychoanalysis, they're very much related, right? So actually, it's important to say that when we talk about sexuality in psychoanalysis, I like this idea. We're talking about something much higher and much lower than sex. So we're talking about all of the kinds of things that surround it, the anxiety that surrounds it, the seduction that surrounds it, the stories we tell ourselves about it. Okay. So let's say the child. We're not going to do the sexual thing. Let's say that the father says something about that the child doesn't understand. Let's say the father says, well, you know my brother, he's an alcoholic. And the child overhears this. And so what happens is the child has this understanding of what it means, right, to be, and even if he asks the parent, might say, look, it's not important for you to know. This is something we can talk about when you're later. You know, Uncle Tommy is a good man. Don't worry about it. Just go off to bed, brush your teeth, and go to bed. The child is sitting there going, what does that mean that Uncle Tommy is an alcoholic, right? So what happens is you have this image for the boy of Uncle Tommy, and what happens is that the child then has to make sense of this. So he says, oh, I know what alcohol is. It's that stuff that comes in the bottle. So Uncle Tommy must be somebody who makes bottles, right? He must be a bottle maker, something like that. So what happens is that Uncle Tommy, this whole image of Uncle Tommy is alcoholic. This whole thing gets split. The story is here, but the part that doesn't fit the story gets repressed into the unconscious. So this is called splitting in psychoanalysis. There are lots of different ways to split, but it's part of what we do. We split something and it gets spitting. Thank you. Spitting. Okay. It's called spitting or splitting. That's what happens. Is that it gets split and this gets repressed. So this story we tell ourselves about it, this is the imaginary. Even when you're not splitting, you're still in the imaginary because you're always splitting a little bit. Like if you say, I don't know, I like Professor X or Professor Y because they're nice, right? It's always a partial understanding you have of Professor X or Professor Y. And so what's happening is you're in the imaginary. There's the story that you tell yourself. It's the way you sort of survive in the world. The real is something we can actually, just like the referent in the sign, between the signifier of the sign and the referent, we can't really get at the real. The only time you can kind of get at the real, I would say, is in bodily sensations. That's probably the closest you come to the real. When you start, when you start sweating when you're afraid, this is kind of the breaking through of the real breaking through. The symbolic is the whole way in which we are constructed as subjects. Language, discourse, all of our identities, that's the symbolic, right? Male, female, transgender, all these these are different parts of the symbolic. Which is not I'm not saying they're not super important, Jewish, Christian, whatever, they're all part, but they're part of the symbolic. They're the symbolic structure of our lives for Lacan. So almost any event happens on three levels, or any experience happens on three levels: the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. Does that make sense what I'm saying? And he wants to differentiate between these things. So let's just take really quickly an example. Let's take an example like a poem. All right, a poem like I don't know. Let's take a poem that we did 2 weeks ago. The idea of order at Key West. She sang Beyond the Genius of the Sea. Right, that poem. That poem, you could say that this on a symbolic level, that poem represented. You could understand it on its symbolic level in terms of the symbolic of the poem would be its language, its images, the way that it conveys itself. All of these, whether it's broken into stanzas, all the formal aspects of it, the language it was written in, the font, all of that's part of the symbolic structure of the poem. All of that's the symbolic structure of the poem. The way you interpret it would be the imaginary aspect. And the real of the poem, that's a difficult question. That's an argument right there. I don't know what you would say, but you might say that you're reading the poem, and suddenly you feel like, I think I did the first time I heard Wallace Stevens read it on an MP3 file. This kind of capacious opening up inside of me, because he has this voice that's very sonorous and surprising and kind of slow, and he does this weird thing where he would say, we should ask ourselves often when she sang. He said, the way he ends things with a question mark, and I just felt this kind of opening up inside of me. I can't explain it or what it meant, but that would be like the real of the poem, and it would be different for every person. The real of the poem. Does that help? Yeah.
Wouldn't that be more considered like an altered version of imagery, where the real would only be known through the writer?
So,
If you read it yourself and you feel
yes,
one thing,
yes.
and you hear it a different way, and you
Yes.
change the way you feel,
Yes.
would that just be an altered imagery, where the true meaning would only be behind the person who created it?
So I don't believe in the true meaning necessarily, and I don't think that the real has much to do with the truth. Okay, so that's one thing I would say. I don't think that Lacan is interested in or believes necessarily in the truth per se at all. But that's a great. What I like about your point is what you're asking me is, hey Ruderman, maybe you're just in another story about it's just another interpretation, another meaning. You never gotten to the real of the poem. But I don't think that, like, as somebody who writes myself and has published things and has it out in the world, once you do it, it's out of your hands. You don't control how people interpret it or think about it, and that is, in a way, a really good thing, because it can be it's the real for them, and it's the same real in a weird way. Like, it's the same real. You walk out of the film, like I have many times, and turn to the person next to me and go, "That was the most amazing thing," and they go, "That was so stupid," right? it was, yeah.
I'm sorry, do you write fiction or nonfiction? Or both?
I don't write fiction, but I write poetry and nonfiction. I write poetry and poetry criticism. I used to write fiction. I ghost wrote a book once.
Wait, you what?
I ghost wrote a book once.
What does that mean?
The author came to me and couldn't finish the book and had a bunch of ideas and thoughts, so I helped him finish it.
Do you get royalties?
What? No, I just get paid a flat fee.
That's cool.
Interesting.
He thanked me as an editor in the introduction. I was like, I'm fine with that. I don't care. I mean, I didn't think it was the greatest book ever written anyway. So I was not like I wanted my name on it necessarily, but.
What if you don't really tell it? Wow, this voice, like the tone or voice, kind of changed at the end.
I kind of went through and regularized a lot of the other text because he was a first-time novelist. So, all right, let's move on to this psychoanalytic perspective. Okay. I think probably the best way to have you move forward would be to break up into your groups and maybe look through. Maybe even one thing you could do is to break up into your groups, have each person read a section, and kind of report back to the group about what they found useful about this section, how they felt it sort of fitting. I'll come around and answer any questions, and then you'll probably over your Google Docs or whatever have to kind of like talk a little bit back and forth about because you're not going to have time to read the whole thing right now, and I'm certain that you haven't read the whole thing. But at least I think this will be a useful way. So again, what you're doing with this assignment for this to hand in this week in psychoanalytic criticism is not an interpretation of a primary text, but an analysis of a secondary text. And you're going to say how you think it fits or doesn't fit, and how you think it works. Okay? Any questions about that? So who's here from Auden? Okay, 3. Who's here from Blake? 3. Who's here from Coleridge? 2. Okay.
Oh, she's here.
I think, but she left.
She had an appointment.
Oh, she had an appointment. Okay, who's here from Dickinson? Okay, good. And who's here from Eliot? Okay, all right. So once you break up into your groups, as long as there's at least 2 of you, then I'm happy. And I'll put some. You want music or not? Yeah. Okay. I got to just turn this off though, so that it.